Sandra Hansen was a woman who had always prided herself on her independence and strong will. At 44 years old, she had built a successful transportation equipment company from the ground up. She had worked tirelessly over the years, sacrificing much of her personal life for her career. However, despite her success in the business world, there was always something missing. She had no one to share her triumphs with, no one to lean on during tough times. She had friends, sure, but they were scattered across the country, caught up in their own busy lives. Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that she was lonely. That was when George came into her life. George was 38, kind and easygoing. He had always been the kind of person who made others feel comfortable in his presence. He worked part-time as a caregiver for his aging parents, which Sandra found admirable. They met at a local cafe one afternoon when Sandra had stopped in for a quick coffee. George had been sitting at a table by the window reading a book. She noticed him immediately, not just because he was attractive, but because there was something about his quiet demeanor that seemed to draw her in. They struck up a conversation, and Sandra quickly realized that George had a unique charm. He wasn't like the men she was used to, business-minded, polished, and always talking shop. Instead, George spoke with sincerity about his family and the challenges he faced while caring for his parents. Sandra listened intently, and for the first time in a long while, she felt seen. She didn't feel like just another businesswoman, but like a person with real emotions. They exchanged numbers before leaving the cafe, and Sandra felt a spark of excitement she hadn't felt in years. The initial dates were full of lighthearted conversations and laughter. Sandra found herself enjoying George's company more and more. There was a warmth to him that made her feel comfortable and understood. As they spent more time together, Sandra began to let her guard down, something she had never done with anyone before. She started sharing her thoughts and fears with him, her struggles in building the company, her feelings of isolation, even her doubts about whether she would ever truly be happy. George listened, never interrupting, and always offering his full attention. But as their relationship deepened, Sandra began to notice things that made her uncomfortable. It was subtle at first, little comments George made about her success. At first, she shrugged them off as casual remarks, but they soon started to feel like criticisms. He would talk about how much easier life was when people didn't have to work as hard as she did, or how he admired people who knew how to relax and enjoy life. Sandra found herself becoming defensive, unsure of how to respond. Was he implying that she worked too much? That she was somehow missing out on life? She began to notice other things as well. George's financial situation seemed less stable than she had initially thought. He didn't seem to have any major career ambitions, and his work as a caregiver was his only source of income. Sandra didn't mind that at first, believing that everyone had different paths in life. But over time, she began to question his long-term goals. Was he content with his part-time job and living off the support of others? Did he have any plans for the future? Sandra pushed these thoughts aside, telling herself she was overthinking things. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. As their relationship grew more serious, George started spending more time at Sandra's apartment. He would stay for days at a time, and Sandra, feeling the pressures of work and her company, grew frustrated. She had always valued her space, but with George around constantly, it began to feel like too much. Her home, once a sanctuary where she could recharge, now felt like a place where her personal boundaries were being tested. One evening, Sandra came home after a long day at the office. She found George sitting on the couch watching television as usual. But this time, something felt off. He didn't get up to greet her as he usually did. Sandra dropped her briefcase by the door and walked over to him, sensing a shift in the air. As she sat beside him, George turned to her with a strained smile. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, "about how much you do for me. I appreciate it, Sandra. Really, I do." Sandra was taken aback. "What do you mean? You know I don't mind helping out." George hesitated before responding. "I know, but I feel like I'm not doing enough in return. I've been thinking, maybe I should start asking for help more often. I don't want to be a burden." Sandra blinked in surprise. "What are you talking about?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Well, my parents, they need more from me now. They're getting older, and I can't do it all on my own. I'm worried that I won't be able to take care of both of them and still be there for you. I don't want to drag you into this, but I might need more financial help from you." Sandra's heart sank. She had always known George was helping his parents, but she hadn't realized the extent of it. She had been so caught up in her own life and struggles that she hadn't paid attention to the financial pressures George was under. But now, sitting in front of her, was a man who was asking for her help, not just emotionally, but financially. It felt wrong, and yet Sandra didn't know how to say no. She had already given him so much of her time and support, and now he was asking for more. She couldn't help but feel a sense of manipulation, though she wasn't sure why. "I don't know, George," Sandra started, but George quickly cut her off. "I promise I don't want to take advantage of you, but my mom, she's been getting worse, and I don't know how much longer I can keep up. I'm just asking for a little help, just for a while. You're the only person who understands." Sandra's mind raced. She felt torn. She had always been the one who took care of herself, who didn't rely on others for help. But now, here was George, someone she cared about, who needed her. She wanted to help him, but something about the way he had presented the situation made her feel uneasy. Was this really just a temporary situation? Or was George beginning to rely on her in a way that would only deepen over time? The following weeks were filled with tension. Sandra began to feel like she was constantly being pulled in different directions. Between managing her business, trying to maintain her relationship with George, and now helping him financially, she felt stretched thin. It was as if her life was no longer her own. George began to ask for more time, more financial assistance, and more emotional energy. Sandra couldn't keep up. One evening, Sandra received a call from her assistant at the office. There had been some issues with the company's finances that needed her immediate attention. She told George that she would have to spend the night at the office catching up on paperwork. But when she arrived at work, something strange happened. She checked her personal accounts online and discovered that a large sum of money had been transferred from her personal account to one of George's. The amount was significant enough to raise alarms. Sandra's heart raced as she realized that George had accessed her account without her permission. At that moment, everything changed. Sandra began to piece together the unsettling pattern of behavior, the subtle manipulations, the constant requests for more, the way he had slowly inserted himself into her life. All of it became clear. George was using her, not just for emotional support, but for financial gain as well. He had planned this all along. With the shock of betrayal still fresh in her mind, Sandra knew she had to confront George. But as she prepared to confront him, she found herself questioning everything about their relationship. Was he truly the man she had fallen for, or had he always been playing a part? Was his love genuine, or had it all been an elaborate scheme to gain access to her wealth and resources? The truth was now undeniable. George had deceived her. But Sandra wasn't sure how far the deception went, or what he would do next. Sandra had always been a woman who valued strength and independence. Her company had been a reflection of her personality, firm, efficient, and successful. She had built it from the ground up, and everything she had achieved was a result of her hard work and determination. Yet, when George had entered her life, he seemed to be the one thing she couldn't control. It wasn't that he was domineering or harsh, but his softness, his kindness, had disarmed her in a way no one else ever had. For the first time, Sandra felt vulnerable. At first, she chalked it up to her busy life, her unyielding focus on work, and her reluctance to dive into another relationship. But George was different. He wasn't the type to demand attention. He was subtle, gentle, like a river quietly eroding the edges of a stone. At first, she believed the best of him. He was thoughtful, always there when she needed him, offering his help without asking for anything in return. But as time passed, Sandra started to feel a gnawing sense of discomfort. It wasn't just George's behavior that had begun to change. It was the circumstances surrounding their relationship. The more she observed, the more she realized something was off. George had started to spend more time with his mother, Miriam. At first, she didn't mind. It seemed like a natural part of his life. But the frequency of his visits had increased, and they began to intrude on their time together. Sandra noticed how George would often speak about his mother with a sense of obligation, as though his relationship with her was more duty than love. yet he never once questioned her needs. Sandra's discomfort grew when she noticed the emotional weight that seemed to drag George down whenever he spoke of his mother. It was clear that Miriam needed him, not just for emotional support, but for practical reasons as well. She was often sick, frail, and dependent on George for nearly everything. He would cancel plans, rearrange his schedule, and often stay up late to tend to his mother's needs. One evening, as Sandra prepared dinner, George had canceled yet another dinner date. He had promised they would spend the evening together, but at the last minute, his mother had called him with an emergency. Sandra tried to suppress her disappointment, but she couldn't help the frustration that bubbled to the surface. She told herself she was being irrational. After all, family came first. But deep down, she felt something else. Something deeper. A sense that George's loyalty to his mother was not only strong, but perhaps even suffocating. Sandra had once believed in the idea of loyalty as a virtue, but now she wondered, was George sacrificing his own happiness for the sake of someone who might never appreciate him? As the weeks passed, Sandra started to feel more isolated. George's emotional energy seemed entirely drained by his mother's needs. When he was with Sandra, he was physically present, but emotionally distant. Sandra began to sense that she was losing him, not to another woman, but to a relationship that was so one-sided it drained everything from him. He had become a caretaker, a shadow of the man she once knew. One night, after another long day at the office, Sandra returned home to find George sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his phone. It was late, and she could tell he hadn't eaten. His eyes were tired, his face drawn. "George?" she asked softly. "How was your mom?" He didn't look up at first. "She's not doing well," he muttered. "I've got to go over there in the morning. She needs me." Sandra bit her lip, resisting the urge to snap. Instead, she forced a calm tone, though her voice wavered slightly. "You're always there for her, George. But what about us? What about our time together?" He paused, then sighed, rubbing his face. "I don't know what to tell you, Sandra. I have to be there for her. She's my mother." Sandra's chest tightened. She knew that, of course. But she also knew that something had to change. George's emotional neglect was beginning to weigh on her. She had always been independent, never needing anyone to validate her choices or actions. But George was a different story. She had let herself open up to him, let him in, and now she was feeling the emptiness of his absence. The next day, she made a decision. She wasn't going to wait any longer for George to recognize what was happening. She needed to confront him, not just about his relationship with his mother, but about their relationship as a whole. That evening, after a quiet dinner, Sandra sat down with George in the living room. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she started simply. "George," she said softly, "we need to talk." He looked up at her, his face weary but alert. "What's going on?" "I can't keep doing this," Sandra said, her voice trembling slightly despite her resolve. "I can't keep competing with your mother for your attention. I don't want to sound selfish, but I need you too." George's face tightened, his hands folding in his lap. "I don't understand. You know how much she means to me. I don't want to hurt you." "I know you don't," Sandra replied, her heart aching. "But I don't know if I can keep being in a relationship where I'm not even considered." He remained silent, his gaze distant. Sandra could see the internal battle raging in his mind, and for a moment, she wondered if he would ever choose her over his mother. But then, she felt it, a realization that struck her like a thunderclap. George wasn't going to change. His loyalty to his mother was too ingrained in him. It was clear that he had no room left to offer her anything beyond what was required by duty. He wasn't manipulating her, but his need to be everything for his mother had left no space for her. As much as Sandra had loved him, she couldn't continue to live in the shadows of that relationship. "I think it's time for us to part ways, George," Sandra said, her voice steady, though her heart was breaking. "I can't keep waiting for you to realize that we're both in this, and I'm not just an afterthought." George's face collapsed into an expression of shock and disbelief. "Sandra, no, please." Don't say that. I'm trying. I'm doing the best I can. I know you are, Sandra replied softly. But it's not enough for me anymore. The days that followed were a blur. Sandra packed her things and moved out of their shared apartment, though it felt more like a formality than a decision. She knew it was the right choice, even if it hurt. Sandra had always believed that self-worth came from within, and now more than ever, she realized how vital it was to preserve that sense of self, especially in the face of someone else's overwhelming needs. As the weeks passed, Sandra's life slowly began to feel whole again. She focused on her work, rediscovered her passions, and started spending time with friends she hadn't seen in months. But there was a lingering sadness, an ache from a love lost, and from the realization that sometimes even love isn't enough. One evening, as Sandra sat at her desk, the phone buzzed. It was a text from George. I miss you. I realize now how much I took you for granted. I'll always be here for you. Sandra stared at the screen for a long moment, her heart aching, but she had already made her peace. She had learned that love, no matter how strong, should never come at the cost of one's own happiness. Sandra pressed delete on the message, a quiet sense of finality washing over her. She had been through enough, and now it was her time to heal, to start anew. In the end, Sandra knew that sometimes the most painful decisions were the ones that led to the greatest growth. She was stronger now, and whatever came next, she would face it alone,